A woman walks into a bustling restaurant, excited to enjoy a peaceful meal, unaware that what would happen next would change everything. The waiter, a young man with an attitude that seemed to match his disinterest, was quick to take her order, but not so quick to hide his contempt. His eyes scanned her in a way that felt uncomfortable, and within moments, a careless, hurtful remark slipped from his lips. It wasn't just an insult. It was a racist comment, one so shocking that it left the woman momentarily frozen. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as she stared at him, not knowing whether to stand up or stay seated. Was this truly happening in a place meant for enjoyment, for people to feel welcome? She, however, wasn't the type to back down. Instead of getting upset, she remained calm. And what happened next stunned everyone, including the waiter. He had no idea who she was, nor the truth that would soon be revealed. A truth so unexpected that it would leave him speechless. But what was it that made her response so powerful? What could possibly be her secret? Stay with us to uncover the truth and witness the unexpected turn of events that no one saw coming. The woman remained seated, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, her mind racing. The words that the waiter had said to her were still echoing in her head, like a broken record. They had been loaded with a sense of superiority, a belief that she was somehow beneath him. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Racism, prejudice, it was something she'd faced before, something she had learned to navigate over the years. But this time, it was different. It felt personal. She sat back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest, as the waiter, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, stood awkwardly in front of her. The restaurant around them was busy, with people laughing, talking, and enjoying their meals. But in that moment, it felt like time had stopped. The energy in the room shifted, though no one could quite put their finger on why. The woman's gaze never left the waiter's face. There was something about the way he was looking at her now, a mix of confusion and uncertainty that seemed to almost unsettle him. He stammered slightly, trying to recover from the slip-up. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." His voice trailed off, but the woman wasn't interested in his apologies. She wasn't interested in his excuses either. He had crossed a line that couldn't be erased with a few empty words. Instead of responding immediately, she studied him carefully, her mind racing to piece together what was happening. She wasn't one to get into conflict, but something about this situation gnawed at her. It wasn't just the insult. It was the casual way in which he'd said it, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. That made it worse, somehow. It wasn't a mistake. It was a reflection of how he truly saw her. The waiter's nervous fidgeting was becoming more pronounced. He shifted from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. His uniform, slightly askew, hinted at his impatience, but the woman didn't care. She wasn't going to make this easy for him. She had learned long ago that silence in moments like this could be just as powerful as words. But still, the silence between them felt suffocating, almost as if it were pulling the tension tighter and tighter. As the moments stretched on, something shifted in her. She wasn't angry, not yet, but the injustice of the situation stirred something deep within her. She had seen this kind of behavior before, this casual dismissal of her worth, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Her calm, steady voice broke the silence, making the waiter snap to attention. "Do you think I wouldn't notice?" she asked, her words cutting through the air like a sharp knife. "Do you really think I wouldn't recognize what you just said?" The waiter opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and shame, and for a brief moment, he looked like a child caught in the act. The woman's eyes softened slightly. She wasn't here to humiliate him. That wasn't her goal, but she knew that some lessons could only be learned the hard way. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and met his gaze head-on. "Do you think it's okay to treat people like that? Do you think that because of who I am, you have the right to disrespect me?" The waiter, at a loss for words, shifted uncomfortably. His mind raced. Was he about to lose his job over something so small? He had made a mistake, sure, but surely it wasn't that bad, right? He had been angry, frustrated, and wasn't thinking clearly. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just a mistake. It was something that had been brewing inside him, something he had hidden for a long time. And now, in front of her, it was all spilling out, raw and unfiltered. The woman waited patiently, watching him wrestle with his own guilt. She had seen this before, the way people tried to justify their actions, the way they tried to downplay their own mistakes. It was the same old song. And for a moment, she wondered if this situation was even worth addressing. Maybe she could just get up, leave, and never come back. But something told her that leaving wouldn't solve anything. The waiter wouldn't learn anything from it, and the cycle would just continue. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. "You know, I could walk out of here right now," she said, her voice calm, yet firm. "I could let you off the hook, pretend like this never happened. But I won't, because that would be the easy thing to do." The waiter's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like he was about to say something. But he hesitated, unsure of what to say, or if he even had the right to speak at all. "I'm not angry," she continued, her voice still steady. "But I'm not going to let you get away with this. You need to understand that your words have consequences. You need to understand that I'm not just someone you can talk down to. And I'm certainly not someone you can disrespect with impunity." The restaurant was still bustling, but the energy had shifted. Several people had started to notice the exchange, though most were too afraid to intervene. It was uncomfortable, and no one wanted to get involved in something that didn't concern them. The waiter, still visibly flustered, shifted his weight nervously. But the woman wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let him think that his words had no weight. She had grown up being told that certain things were just part of life, that some people would always try to bring her down, to make her feel smaller than she was. But she refused to accept that. She wasn't a victim. She was a person, and she would be treated as such. There was something else at play here, something deeper that the waiter didn't understand. The woman's calm demeanor, her ability to speak with such quiet authority, seemed to rattle him more than any angry outburst could have. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and as much as he wanted to apologize, to make things right, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he had to face, something more than just this woman sitting in front of him. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, and in that silence, a strange sense of power began to build. The woman wasn't demanding anything from him, not yet, but she knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in moments like this is to stand your ground. She could have walked away, but that would have been too easy. She could have let him off the hook, but that wouldn't have taught him anything. For the first time in the exchange, the waiter looked down at the floor. His eyes darted back and forth, like he was searching for an escape, but there was none. His world had just gotten smaller, and he was beginning to realize that he might have just made a mistake that he couldn't fix with a simple apology. He cleared his throat, then tried again. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence hang in the air, as if she were considering whether or not his apology was sincere. She could tell he was uncomfortable, but that wasn't enough. She needed to know that he truly understood the weight of his words, the damage they could cause. And somehow she doubted that he did. She looked him in the eye again, her expression unreadable. "Apologies don't fix everything," she said softly. "And this isn't just about you saying you're sorry. It's about understanding why what you said was wrong, and taking responsibility for it." The waiter's face reddened even further, but he remained silent. He couldn't find the words to respond, and for the first time, the woman sensed that he was starting to realize how deep the problem went, how much he had yet to learn. In the back of her mind, the woman knew that this moment wasn't about her, at least not entirely. It was about him. And as much as he wanted to shrink away, to pretend it hadn't happened, she knew the truth was that this was his moment of reckoning, Would he rise to the occasion, or would he walk away unchanged, content to keep living in his ignorance? Only time would tell. The air in the restaurant felt thick, as if the entire room had come to a standstill, locked in the tension of what was unfolding. The woman's gaze remained fixed on the waiter, not out of malice, but because she needed him to see the gravity of what had just happened. Her heart was steady, but her mind was racing, trying to calculate what would happen next. Would he rise to the challenge, or would he crumble under the pressure? She couldn't help but wonder how many others he had treated like this, how many people had just walked away, accepting it without a second thought. The waiter's eyes darted nervously across the room, as if searching for some kind of escape, but there was none. His world had closed in around him, and the weight of his actions was pressing down on him harder with every second that ticked by. The silence between them was deafening, stretching out like an eternity, and he could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. It wasn't just her gaze, it was the realization that this wasn't some trivial misunderstanding. His words had struck at something much deeper. He had hurt her, and in doing so, he had exposed himself. For a brief moment, he wished he could go back, take the words back, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He couldn't undo what he had said. The woman, sitting in front of him, wasn't asking for an apology. She was asking for understanding. And that, he realized with growing dread, was the part he couldn't fake. He couldn't just say he was sorry and move on. Not this time. She watched his every move, her expression unreadable, but beneath her calm exterior, she was alert, waiting for him to finally acknowledge the truth. The longer he hesitated, the more she wondered whether this was even about him understanding the hurt he had caused or about something bigger, something that transcended this moment. Maybe this was the universe forcing him to confront something he had been ignoring for far too long. The waiter finally spoke again, his voice unsteady. I don't know what you want from me," he admitted, his words coming out in a rush. "I messed up. I get that. But I didn't mean it like that. I don't even know why I said it." He paused, his hand shaking slightly as he fidgeted with the notepad in his pocket. "It just came out, and now you're making it like it's who I am. It's not. I swear, it's not." His words hung in the air, but the woman didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what she was looking for in his eyes, but it was clear now that he was fighting with himself, caught between his own guilt and his attempts to defend himself. There was a flicker of sincerity, but it was buried beneath layers of defensiveness and confusion. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way he couldn't quite look her in the eye for more than a few seconds. For a moment, she let the silence stretch on, letting him feel the weight of her unwavering gaze. She wasn't going to make it easy for him to escape this. She wasn't going to let him pretend like it didn't matter. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and she could sense the collective attention of the room shifting toward them, even if they were pretending not to notice. The other diners were stealing glances, their curiosity piqued, wondering what would happen next. He shifted his weight again, looking around the room as if searching for someone, something to intervene. But the truth was, no one else could save him. The only thing that mattered now was whether he could face the reality of what he had done, or whether he would continue to deny it and let the moment slip away unresolved. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, self-justifications, and guilt, but none of it seemed to matter. The woman wasn't interested in his excuses. She was interested in something deeper, something he wasn't ready to confront yet. The longer they sat there in silence, the heavier the air became. The waitstaff and kitchen staff seemed to move more slowly, as if the entire restaurant had collectively held its breath. The man's expression had shifted from confusion to something closer to fear. Fear of what, though? Fear of losing his job? Fear of being exposed for who he really was? Or fear of facing the uncomfortable truth that he had hurt someone in a way that could never be undone? The woman finally spoke, her voice low but unyielding. "You say you didn't mean it, but that doesn't change what you said," she pointed out, her tone steady but firm. "You can try to justify it all you want, but the reality is that your words matter. They matter to me. They matter to everyone who hears them, and they matter to you, whether you realize it or not. The waiter's eyes were wide now, a combination of realization and fear setting in. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to die before they could leave his lips. He had no defense left, not when confronted with the simple truth of what he had done. His breathing became shallow, and his hands were visibly trembling. She could see the internal struggle on his face. He wanted to apologize, to somehow make it right. But deep down, he knew that his apology alone wouldn't fix the damage. He couldn't undo the harm that had been done, and he couldn't erase the fact that this wasn't just a random outburst. His actions were a reflection of something deeper, something ingrained in his attitude, his perspective on the world. And then, just when it seemed like the tension could no longer build, the waiter spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The woman leaned in, her eyes narrowing slightly as she held his gaze. "I want you to see me," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I want you to understand that I'm not just a target for your frustration or your ignorance. I'm a person. I want you to recognize that we all deserve respect, regardless of what we look like or where we come from. I don't need your pity. I need your acknowledgement. I need you to understand why what you said was wrong and why it's not something you can just sweep under the rug." The words were simple, but they carried weight, and in that moment, the waiter seemed to shrink, as if the enormity of what he had done was finally sinking in. His expression was one of realization, of someone beginning to understand the ripple effect of their own actions. It wasn't just about one insult, one mistake. It was about an entire mindset, an entire way of viewing others that had to change. He could no longer pretend that his actions were isolated. He could no longer live in denial. The woman wasn't looking for him to grovel or beg for forgiveness. What she needed, what they all needed, was for him to confront the truth and to change. The question was, would he? Would he see this as a moment of growth or a moment of humiliation? And what would that mean for both of them, as individuals, and for the world they were trying to navigate? The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, as the room waited for something to break. The seconds stretched on, every heartbeat amplified in the stillness. What would he say next? Would this moment mark a turning point for him? Or would it be just another forgotten incident, buried beneath layers of denial and indifference? It was a question no one had an answer for, but one that was about to change everything. Just as the silence between them reached a boiling point, the sound of the restaurant door opening sliced through the tension. A new group of customers walked in, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the thick atmosphere that had settled over the room. But one of them, a tall man with a sharp suit and an air of authority, paused mid-step as his eyes scanned the room. His gaze fell directly on the woman and the waiter. The waiter's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and his eyes widened in panic. He had clearly recognized the man, but the woman, still unwavering, didn't let the new presence shake her. She kept her eyes locked on the waiter, waiting for him to answer. But it wasn't the waiter who broke the silence this time. It was the man in the suit, who suddenly approached the table with an almost casual confidence. "Is everything okay here?" the man asked, his voice smooth, but carrying an undertone that suggested he was accustomed to handling situations just like this. His eyes flicked between the woman and the waiter, as if reading the tension in the air. The woman, momentarily caught off guard, turned her attention toward him, still sitting straight, unmoved. Before the waiter could respond, the man turned toward him. "You should have known better," he said, his tone not harsh but firm, almost patronizing. "You're smarter than this, right?" There was something off about the way he spoke, like this wasn't the first time he'd seen this kind of behavior. The waiter's voice faltered as he stammered an apology, but the man didn't let him finish. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head before turning back to the woman. "I'm sorry you had to experience that," he said, his words almost too rehearsed. "We take these matters very seriously here." But the woman wasn't fooled by the man's polished veneer. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he spoke to the waiter, that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just that he seemed to be stepping in with an air of authority. It was the way he dismissed the waiter's actions with such ease, as if it were all part of the normal course of business. She could sense there was something deeper at play. "You should," she said, her voice calm but sharp, as she met his eyes. "But something tells me you don't." "Not really." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. He looked like he was about to respond, but then stopped himself, as if weighing his words carefully. The waiter, looking increasingly uncomfortable, glanced back and forth between them, his anxiety palpable. "Is everything okay?" the man asked again, this time his tone shifting. There was a subtle edge to it now, like he was trying to gauge whether or not he needed to escalate things further. The woman leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes now, a quiet confidence. "I was about to ask him the same thing," she said, her gaze still fixed on the waiter. "I think you need to ask him about his attitude, and whether this is the kind of environment you want running under your roof." The man chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I assure you," he said, "we handle these things professionally. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." But the way he said it didn't reassure her. If anything, it raised more questions. She could tell there was more to this situation than met the eye. The tension in the room thickened once again, and the eyes of the other diners subtly flicked between the scene unfolding before them. What was going on here? The man, with his polished suit and carefully chosen words, was clearly trying to diffuse the situation, but there was a strange air of discomfort around him, like he was more invested in shutting the confrontation down than actually addressing the core issue. The waiter, sensing his opportunity, finally spoke up, though his voice was small and filled with unease. "I didn't mean it," he repeated. "I swear. I don't know what happened. It was a slip of the tongue. That's all." But the woman wasn't listening anymore. She could see through the performative apologies, the polite gestures. The more she looked at the man in the suit, the more she realized that he wasn't just some random customer stepping in to smooth things over. His presence felt orchestrated, calculated, as if this were all part of something bigger. There was a familiarity in the way the waiter reacted to him, a kind of subservience that felt off. "Tell me," she said, her voice now sharp, "who are you really? And what's your connection to him?" She pointed to the waiter without looking at him. The man's face froze for a moment. Then his smile faltered. The air in the room seemed to crackle with the sudden shift in energy. For the first time, the man's calm exterior slipped, and the woman could see the flicker of something, fear, maybe, or something even darker, pass across his face. He cleared his throat, straightening up, but the woman had already hit a nerve. "I'm just a concerned customer," he said, his voice tight, but the words didn't hold the same weight anymore. She could tell he was lying, the tension in his voice betraying him. There was something more happening here, and she was beginning to piece it together. The waiter's reaction, the strange way the man had stepped in, all of it felt like a carefully managed scene that didn't quite add up. And then, just as the woman was about to press him further, a loud crash from the kitchen shattered the fragile calm in the restaurant. A plate had fallen, followed by the frantic sound of hurried footsteps. The distraction was enough to make both the man and the waiter turn their attention briefly toward the noise. But in that split second, the woman's suspicion grew even more. The tension in the room had just shifted from uncomfortable to ominous. Something was off, and it wasn't just the incident with the waiter. She stood up slowly, her gaze not leaving the man. "I think it's time you and I had a real conversation," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. And for the first time, she saw the man falter. He took a deep breath, his eyes darting toward the door, his fingers twitching slightly as if he was debating whether to walk away or confront her head-on. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and she could feel the weight of the room bearing down on them. Something big was about to break wide open. She didn't know what it was yet, but the pieces were starting to click into place. It wasn't just about the waiter anymore. There was something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface, something far more sinister, and she was right at the heart of it. And just when it seemed like everything would erupt into chaos, the man spoke again, his voice now a low murmur that only she could hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." His words were a warning, but they only fueled the fire inside her. The man's words hung in the air, the threat veiled beneath a veneer of calm. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it felt like an accusation, one that would hang over them all if left unchecked. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply stared at him, her eyes narrowed, reading him like an open book. Something in her gut told her the moment was approaching, the moment where everything would unravel. She had to be prepared, ready for whatever came next. The tension in the room intensified as everyone waited, breaths held. The man shifted his weight, as if calculating his next move, but she was already a step ahead of him. She was no longer interested in his words. They meant nothing to her. What mattered now was his actions, and the truth buried beneath his carefully constructed facade. The woman's hand moved slowly to the small purse at her side, her fingers brushing over the leather as she took a quiet, deliberate breath. She could feel the heat of the man's stare, and though he tried to maintain his composure, she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. His confidence was starting to crack. He wasn't used to this kind of pressure. With one swift motion, she stood up, her posture straight and unwavering. The man took a half step back, his eyes darting to the door. For a split second, it looked as though he might attempt to make a break for it. But she had anticipated this. She was done playing games, done with the polite, rehearsed pleasantries. She wasn't going to let him leave without facing the consequences. "You think you can intimidate me?" she asked, her voice strong, cutting through the silence. "You think I'm afraid of you, of your empty threats?" The man's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but this time, she didn't let him. "I know who you are," she said, the words slicing through the air like a knife. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, and for the first time, his demeanor faltered. His eyes widened just slightly, and a small bead of sweat formed at his temple. She had him now. The woman stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You think this is just about a mistake, about some misunderstood words. It's not. It's about power, manipulation, and control." She spoke with a calm fury, a fire that burned just beneath the surface. "You hide behind your fancy suits and your polished smiles. But the truth is, you're nothing but a coward." The man's expression was unreadable, but his hands trembled ever so slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, but the cracks were showing. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, his voice strained. But the woman did know. She knew far more than he could have imagined. In that moment, everything she had suspected. The unease, the connections, the strange way the waiter had acted, came rushing to the surface. The man wasn't just some wealthy, influential figure trying to cover up an embarrassing moment. He was the mastermind behind a deeper web of manipulation, and the waiter was just another pawn in his game. She had seen the subtle signals, the unspoken exchanges, the waiter's fear when the man entered the room, the way he had almost instantly deferred to him, like someone who owed a debt. This wasn't a random act of disrespect. It was part of a much bigger picture, one that the woman had unknowingly walked into. And now she was determined to take it down. "You don't get to control me," she said quietly, but the weight of her words made the man visibly recoil. For a brief second, he seemed to lose his footing. She wasn't afraid anymore. He was no longer the predator. Now it was his turn to feel hunted. And then, as the man opened his mouth to speak again, the door to the back kitchen flew open with a sudden crash, and a figure emerged, breathless and wild-eyed. The woman's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the face of the restaurant's manager, someone she hadn't seen all evening. He was panting, clearly frantic, and his eyes darted to the man in the suit with a mixture of fear and guilt. I can't," the manager stammered, barely able to catch his breath. He's, he's the one pulling the strings. The whole thing. It's all connected. The room froze. All eyes turned toward the manager, and the man in the suit stiffened, his carefully maintained facade now cracking in real time. The tension in the air was palpable. The manager's face was pale, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. "You don't have to do this," the manager pleaded, his voice trembling with desperation. "I didn't want to get involved, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It's him, the man you're talking to." His gaze flicked to the woman, his eyes filled with a strange mix of apology and regret. He's been bribing people, covering up incidents like this one. The whole restaurant, everything, has been a front for his illegal deals. The woman's stomach dropped as the revelation hit her. It wasn't just about the waiter anymore. It was a web of deceit, corruption, and manipulation that reached much further than she could have ever imagined. The man standing in front of her wasn't just a customer with a bad attitude. He was the architect of a much larger operation, one that extended far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The shock of the manager's words rippled through the room, and the man in the suit finally seemed to lose all control. His confident posture crumbled, and the dark truth began to seep into the light. The woman watched as his face twisted in frustration, a silent fury building in his eyes. He wasn't going to walk away from this. No, the stakes had just been raised. "Enough," the man hissed, his voice low and threatening. But his power was slipping away. The woman didn't back down. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "The truth is out, and you're not getting away this time." Her words rang like a bell, and for the first time, the man seemed to understand the severity of his situation. He wasn't just facing a confrontation over a rude comment anymore. He was facing a full-blown expose of his entire operation. And just when it seemed like the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, there was a loud commotion outside, and a police siren wailed in the distance. The woman's heart raced. This was it. The climax had arrived. But just as she turned to walk toward the door, ready to see this all come to an end, something unexpected happened. The waiter, who had been a silent observer throughout it all, stepped forward, his expression completely transformed. It was the last thing she expected. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "I didn't know what I was part of until now." The twist hit her like a tidal wave. The waiter had been in on it all along. He wasn't just a victim, he was an accomplice. She hadn't seen it coming. And just like that, the story took another unexpected turn, leaving everything hanging in the balance. The woman's heart pounded as the waiter spoke, his words hanging in the air like an unexpected bombshell. She had thought him to be just another pawn in the man's game, another frightened employee caught in the web of manipulation. But now, as he stood before her, his eyes no longer filled with fear, but with something else. Guilt, maybe, or even defiance. She realized just how wrong she had been. The situation was far more complicated than she had first imagined. "I didn't know," the waiter continued, his voice low but steady. "At first, it was just small things. Little favors, you know. Keeping quiet about the things that didn't seem right. But as time went on, I realized I was part of something much bigger. I was in too deep." His voice faltered for a moment before he straightened up, his eyes meeting hers. "I didn't want it to go this far. But now, it's too late." The words cut through the room like a knife. The woman stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. She had assumed he was just another victim of the man's manipulation, but now it seemed there was more to his story. The guilt in his eyes was undeniable, but so was the recognition that he had been complicit in the very system he now wanted to expose. For a moment, everything was still. The man in the suit, now clearly rattled, took a step back, his face hardening, eyes narrowing with barely contained anger. The manager, still standing at the edge of the scene, seemed to shrink into the background. The tension in the room had escalated once again, each person holding their breath as the next move was uncertain. The woman shifted her attention back to the waiter. "You're telling me you've been working with him this whole time?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. You've been part of this corrupt system. The waiter nodded, his face flushed with shame. I didn't know how bad it was. At first, it was just favors, small things, but then it became bigger, more dangerous. I got involved, and I thought I could handle it. I didn't think it would get this far. But I see it now, everything he's been doing. The bribes, the deals, the cover-ups. I didn't know what I was part of until I saw you standing here, calling him out. The woman took a deep breath, trying to absorb everything. She had always believed people were shaped by their choices, that they could break free from the webs they were caught in. But now, standing in front of this man, this waiter who had let himself become complicit, she wondered if redemption was still possible. Could someone like him, caught in a system of corruption, find a way out? Or was it already too late for him to? Do you want out? She asked, her voice hard but with a tinge of empathy. Do you want to do the right thing? Or are you just going to keep pretending you didn't know? The waiter's eyes softened, a flicker of hope crossing his face. I want out. I've been too scared to speak up, too afraid of what would happen to me. But if you can bring this all down, if you can expose him for what he really is, then I'll do whatever it takes to help. The woman stared at him for a long moment, weighing his words. She had seen the fear in his eyes, but now she also saw the spark of determination. He was no longer just a part of the problem. He was finally ready to be part of the solution. She nodded slowly. Then we're in this together. With a deep breath, she turned her attention to the man in the suit, who was visibly fuming. The anger in his eyes burned bright, but now he knew he was cornered. The woman had exposed the truth, and there was no way for him to hide behind his power anymore. You think you can threaten me? The woman asked, her voice firm. You think you can intimidate people into silence? That's where you're wrong. She stepped closer to him, her gaze unwavering. The truth is out now. You can't cover it up anymore. The man's face twisted into a grimace. You have no idea what you're dealing with. He spat, his voice laced with venom. You think exposing me will change anything. You think this will stop me. He took a step forward, trying to loom over her, but she didn't flinch. You're wrong, she said again, her voice calm but unyielding. Because now that it's all out in the open, the people who've been covering for you won't protect you anymore. You're on your own. For a moment, it seemed as though the man might try to strike, to lash out. But then, something in his eyes shifted, an almost imperceptible change. He glanced toward the manager, who had stayed silent throughout the confrontation, and the fear in his eyes was palpable. It was clear now. The man wasn't the untouchable figure he had once been. He was a man on the brink of losing everything. And the woman was the one who held the power. The sirens outside grew louder, and the woman knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities arrived. She had done everything she could. The truth was out. The pieces had finally fallen into place, and now it was time to face the consequences. Get out, she said firmly to the man in the suit. It's over for you. He hesitated for a moment, his pride fighting against the reality of his situation. But then, as if defeated, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind the remnants of his empire, his illusions of control. The room exhaled a collective breath as the weight of his departure seemed to lift. The manager, his face still pale, approached the woman cautiously. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was scared, too. He had a hold on everyone in this place. But I'll do whatever it takes to make this right now. The woman nodded, acknowledging his apology, but knowing it wasn't enough. Redemption wasn't something that could be earned overnight, but it was a start. She didn't trust him yet, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. As the sound of sirens grew closer, the waiter, now looking like a man who had finally found some clarity, stepped up to the woman. Thank you, he said quietly, for helping me see the truth. I don't know how I can make up for what I've done, but I want to try. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You'll have a chance to make things right," she said, "but it's up to you to prove it." Moments later, the door opened, and the police entered, their presence a final punctuation to the chaos that had unfolded. The woman watched as they moved swiftly, taking the man in the suit into custody, his once steely confidence now replaced with desperation. The authorities would handle the rest, and she had done what she set out to do. As the police processed the man and began speaking to the others, the woman stood quietly in the corner, watching it all unfold. She had come to the restaurant looking for answers, not knowing how deep the corruption ran, not knowing that the truth she uncovered would shatter the lives of those involved. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, she felt a quiet sense of relief wash over her. She had done the right thing. She had stood her ground, exposed the truth, and refused to be intimidated. But there was something more, the lingering feeling that this was just the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But for now, she knew she had won. As the restaurant slowly emptied out, the woman walked out into the cold night air, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle in. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she would never stop fighting for what was right.